Thank you, guys. Can you all hear me clearly? So, first of all, I want to thank you very, very specifically for being here at 3 p.m. It's positively Arctic today. The cold is very similar to a metaphorical comparison I'm going to make just now about mountaineering. It's exceptionally cold. So for you to be here, you're honoring me because I know that if I was a student, I'd probably be curled up back in my res or my dorm, etc. So I'm gonna do my best to add some value to your lives. So I'm speaking today about the future of work, and I've decided to take a completely different perspective on it. I'm wanting to give a very fresh perspective on it. I've done a lot of research on what people do say about the future of work, and I regard it as interesting and somewhat misleading. But let's cover our bases first before I get into what I would like to talk about. So, the future of work will generally focus on the impact of automation and artificial intelligence and robotics on society and on jobs. And many institutions have done significant studies on how the job landscape by industry is going to change. Specifically, the World Economic Forum did a report in 2018, the Future of Jobs report. And they focus particularly on different kinds of roles such as payment clerks, secretaries, auditors, bank tellers, cashiers, and how these jobs would be eliminated to some extent. Specifically, they said that 71% of total task hours are performed by humans and just 29% by machines. So that kind of amazed me, is that I didn't even know it was that much. The 29% of work, task hours, are performed by machines. But by 2022, that's around the corner, this average is expected to have shifted, with 58% of task hours being performed by humans and 42% by machines. McKinsey, their research side, has said that activities most susceptible to automation involve physical activities in highly structured and predictable environments, as well as the collection and processing of data. In the United States, these activities make up 51% of activities in the economy, accounting for almost $2.7 trillion in wages. Now, I find these facts interesting, but not particularly helpful. And I would also argue that some of them are kind of akin to the predictions that kind of the Malthusian predictions of overpopulation or running out of food and water, and somehow are interesting in a kind of macroeconomic sense. But I would argue that if I'm going to be asked to speak about the future of work, I'd like to make it more personal and actually speak to you as individuals, so that you can take something away from this talk that's not a statistic. And I've thought very long and hard about the things that I would like to say. So the first thing I'd like to say, and I've got 6 main points, and I'm going to go through them quite rapidly. The first thing I'd like to say is jobs are changing. And a very good example, so a case study of an example, is project management. So in a firm, in a large organization, which hires the majority of jobs, that creates the most jobs. So for example, at a large bank or a large insurer, project management is very important, because either you have business as usual tasks, which is someone does a monthly process, for example, management accounts, or you have change. And change as a project, so a change project, would have billions of rands of budget. So, for example, a large bank wants to implement a new transactional system, and that's going to cost 2 billion rand. So this is how the world works. Is you had large projects, multi-billion rand projects, and people would become inculcated into this culture of project management. So you had something called PMBOK, which is the project management body of knowledge. And you would have project assistant, project manager, and people would study project management. And project management was the manner in which large-scale change projects took place in organizations. That was disrupted significantly in the last couple of years. And this is how it was disrupted. Someone came along and said, projects fail. The failure rate of projects is very high. We've spent billions of rands and we haven't got return on investment. So we're going to not think like this anymore. We're going to think agile. There was a new science. There's going to be new names for things like Scrum Master, Jedi Master. And they created this idea that you would have an agile way of thinking and you would have 2-week sprints. So you wouldn't have a full scope of what you're doing for the next 2-3 years to implement the system. You'd buy the software and then you would do 2-week sprints and you'd get tasks done. You'd see how, and continuous learning. So obviously, this is a good idea. It's not necessarily going to solve all problems. And I would argue that there's a place for project management. But large organizations such as the large banks in South Africa, one of them in particular, eliminated all project management jobs. They asked 1,500 people to reapply for their jobs. Anyone who had the word project in their title had to reapply for a job as a Scrum Master or a Jedi Master. I'm not joking with you. This actually happened recently in our client base. It's very hard to understand this. And these people who had these skills that they developed over years to run projects now had to reapply for their jobs as Scrum Master. This has got nothing to do with artificial intelligence. This has got nothing to do with automation. This is change as it's happening. Now, I like to compare it to Edmund Hillary. When Edmund Hillary climbed Everest, and the people that came before him, they went expedition style. They went to the mountain with hundreds of porters, with oxygen canisters, with oxygen masks, with tents, with food, with operations. That's what a project is like. Then they conquered the mountain. It took them months. In the 1970s, 1980s, along came alpinism, alpinists of the highest order. Even before that, you had Walter Bonatti and then Reinhold Messner, and they went without oxygen. They went light and fast, and they were fit. They had a different skill set, not an organizational skill set. They had an individual skill set. They were able to ascend Everest without oxygen because they were fit enough and fast enough to get to the top and down in 48 hours to 56 hours. This is the comparison I make to the future of work. Expedition-style work will exist, where you can be a cog, you could be a porter or have a role or a job. I am this person going to do this job. But you're more likely to come across this idea of being multi-skilled, fast and light. So that's point number one. Agile equals alpine style. Alpine style, not expedition style. That's going to be more likely in the future. But I need to point out one of the ironies of this, and I often point this out to senior bankers and executives at banks, is the death toll, the mortality rate of alpinists is far higher than that of expedition-style mountaineers. You're more likely to perish in an alpine-style ascent than an expedition-style ascent. So your risks are higher. The second point I want to make is this, is we speak a lot about personal branding, and you'll hear a lot of people speak about projecting yourself. You've got your LinkedIn profile, you've got an Instagram profile, you've got a Facebook profile. We are communicating with each other more digitally and less in person than we used to. This has made us more efficient, sure. Email, I can broadcast to an email group, WhatsApp groups, it's more efficient. But there is a downside as well. And I think the messaging is sometimes wrong. We speak about networking events, and I want to network, and I'm good at networking. And I want to read to you from a person who provides a different perspective on this. He wrote a book, Paul Mason wrote a book called Post-Capitalism. So it's a critique of the capitalist, neoliberal, Western metaphysic that we all live and exist in. And he says this, he quotes from a professor from the London School of Economics called Richard Sennett. And Richard Sennett studies specifically the impact of greater job flexibility within a highly mobile, tech-enabled workforce. So I'll give you an example. I lecture in the strategic thinking class at GCT in Bachelor of Business Science. And my first lecture, say 150 people came. My second lecture, say 50 people came. Because they can all get it on video. The visceral experience of me being present with you here now was it's regarded less and less as important. And there's a danger to this. We cannot summarize it in a video, in that 2D landscape. You can't summarize that visceral experience. But here's what Richard Sennett says about it. He says, if work rewards detachment and superficial compliance, values adaptability over skill, and networking over loyalty, this creates a new kind of worker. He or she is focused on the short term, very much like Agile. In life, as in work, very much like relationships, not taking relationships as seriously as we used to, and lacks commitment to hierarchies and structures, both at work and in activism. And by activism, Paul Mason is speaking about political activism. So I see this constantly, is the way we react to news, the way we absorb news. I would say we all agree that we live in a world of post-truth. There is no truth anymore. I used to live in a world where at 8 o'clock we would watch the TV news. It was the news. It was true because it was the news. The fact that I lived in apartheid South Africa and the news was controlled by an apartheid regime, at that point in time, perhaps I did not have the fullness of understanding of what the news was. We now live in a world where there is no single source of news. It's so it is so conflicting what the truth is. So what Richard Sennett and what Paul Mason are getting across is that networking in a digital world, what is apparently the future, you should be very careful of. Loyalty, not networking, is what's going to distinguish it. And when I look back at someone who's, say, got 25 years of experience, and I interview a number of people for jobs, sometimes very senior folk, and I look at careers, and I look at on paper, and I can tell you that there's a correlation between the number of jobs a person has had and failure. Failure by their own account. In other words, I see a lot of CVs that have people jumping from one position to another, and I've got this metaphor for it, which is this curve that you can't really see. But if you think about a two-dimensional axis, so think about a two-dimensional axis. So on the y-axis, let's call it, I would like to call it trust. But for argument's sake, let's call it success. Your measurement of success should be correlated to my measurement of success, which would be freedom to do what you want with your life via financial means, via time. So time and money. That's success. And on the x-axis is time and effort spent to achieve that. And that graph is non-linear. It goes like this. It goes flat, 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 and then it has an apex point, and then it goes up in a very non-linear fashion. What happens, I find, with people is that they work quite hard in a job, and in their job they work hard, and then just at the point of inflection, when it is most beneficial to them to continue doing what they're doing, they stop and go to another job. And I look at CVs where someone's got like 8 times 3 years in 8 different jobs, in 8 different companies. And this has been encouraged now in the future of work discussion. If you read about individualism and if you read about promotion of individual brands, and if you look at the way people promote themselves on social media, particularly in a LinkedIn, Instagram, Facebook world, it ignores this fact is that in real life, loyalty and commitment is the inflection point, and going through that apex to achieve success, that's where it really happens. And that's not going to change. That's going to become even more critical in a world where people are more short-term in their thinking. The key to success is making a decision, sticking to it, completing a task. That is the key to success. It's not promoting your brand. It's not networking. The next point I'd like to make is this concept of free play and mindfulness. I have a daughter who's 8 years old, and she goes to a school in Johannesburg, and she told me the other day that she has a period of time between, say, 11:30 in the morning and 12 o'clock where she gets free play. And my heart broke. I mean, it was really painful for me to hear that, because I would like to ask, and I asked this about mindfulness as well, if at 8 you have to be told when you can play freely, how sad is that? How sad is it that we live in a world today where you have to define the period of time where you have free play? We have become very good at containing our pleasure of life into half-hour segments, yoga classes, mindfulness classes, and some of us have to go to psychologists and psychiatrists to deal with this world. There's an increase in mental illness, particularly in this country, and there's a correlation with the stress factors that we absorb. I'm very, very glad to have the opportunity to stand here and talk about the future of work and to refuse to talk about it in a way that is correlated to automation and AI and robotics. I think those things are increasing our stress levels. Our jobs aren't going to disappear in the future. They're going to need us even more, I can tell you that. They're going to need people who are loyal, and they're going to need people who are committed and who work hard. But mostly they're going to need the humanity that is missing from concepts such as defined periods of free play. I would like to introduce you, if you haven't met, a person of great importance, a psychologist called Viktor Frankl. Viktor Frankl, by show of hands, who's heard of Viktor Frankl? Okay, quite a few of you. So you won't mind if I just explain to everyone else Viktor Frankl. So Viktor Frankl was a psychologist living in Austria, I believe, and he was Jewish and got, in the Second World, in the Hitler years, the late 1930s, got put into a concentration camp in Auschwitz, separated from his wife in a line, and he was alone in the snow in the winter of 1939, 1940, in a death camp. And he had this moment of enormous epiphany and meaning, which was to see the joy in the power of human existence. And he then later went on to write a book called Man's Search for Meaning. Afterwards, he goes back. He survives the Holocaust. His wife survives the Holocaust. They go back to Austria, and he invents a new kind of psychology called logotherapy. He writes a book called The Doctor and the Soul, and it is a beautiful book, and it's got chapters. The meaning of life is one chapter. The meaning of love is another chapter. The meaning of work is another chapter. And he makes a point in that chapter on the meaning of work that if you ask three different nurses, what they do, the one nurse will say, well, she cleans up dirty bedpans, and she cleans the floor, and she has to deal with sick patients. Second nurse might say she administers drugs that are required by the doctor. She follows her tasks to completion. She comes in at a certain time and she gets briefed, and sometimes she learns more. And then the third nurse might say, I relieve pain. I help. I make people better. All three nurses are doing the same tasks, but they have three distinct and separate interpretations of what they do. It's very important for me to get this idea across that it is not the tasks themselves, but how you feel and experience those tasks that will distinguish how you feel and experience work. And if you're not happy in your work, it does not mean that you're not happy in your tasks. Perhaps you're not happy in yourself. It doesn't mean you should do work that you don't want to do. Of course, you should pursue the work you want to pursue. But you should always be self-aware that happiness is not a God-given thing. It has to be consciously experienced. Consciously experienced. In a world in which we're being told that robots are going to take our jobs, I think it has to be more consciously experienced. I mean, I find it very interesting. I find it very, very interesting. There's recent reports being written by the World Economic Forum about the human-machine interface, as if this were an actual thing. It is a thing, of course. I mean, I look at my phone and then it opens up my bank account, and these are trivialities. Isaac Asimov, the science fiction writer, who wrote I, Robot, and he also wrote Do Androids Dream of Electric Sheep, which then became the Blade Runner movie with Harrison Ford, which then became the later Blade Runner movie. That was what the original book was called, Do Androids Dream of Electric Sheep. And I read it when I was a kid. And in I, Robot, he had 10 laws. Maybe it was 12 laws. I make that up. But there were laws, like commandments, for how robots and humans should interact. And this was written in the 1960s. I get so annoyed, maybe unfairly, but I get really annoyed with this idea that the human-machine interface is a new idea. This problem has existed for a long time. The problem is not that there are machines that we have to interface with. It's the way that we interact with each other. And it's the lack of collaboration and the fact that we network with each other. You know what networking means? How can I extract value from you as fast as possible? That's what networking means. Let's stop networking so much. Another point I'd like to make is this: is the future of work. The future of work. Every generation, every year, has this concept that we're on the cusp of some dramatic change. that something radical is going to change and that we need to prepare ourselves radically for something radical. But doesn't it strike you as amazing and quite depressing that it is the 50th anniversary of the moon landing? Doesn't it strike you as incredible that 50 years ago, Neil Armstrong put his foot on the moon? And that was the first of 12 Apollo missions. And in each Apollo mission, there were 3 pilots, 2 of whom would land on the moon and 1 who stayed in the shuttle, 1 who stayed in the pod. So only 24 people have ever stood on the moon. They went from 1969 into the 1970s, and then no more. No more work on the moon, no Mars, nothing. At that time, 50 years ago, they didn't even have the processing power of what we called, in my day, a 286 chip. Your phone, your iPad has got 5,000 times more processing. I mean, I'm making this up. Probably 50,000 times more processing power than the computers that ran the Apollo missions. We talk about radical change via automation, etc. The personal computer, the internet, the cell phone has already been invented. You guys probably, to a large extent, grew up with these things. This was far more radical a change than anything that's happening today. We have maybe, hopefully, an electric car on the way. You know, we're using more, less fuel consumption. You know, there's some move towards sustainability of plastics. But I would argue with you that if you want radical change, a man stepping on the moon, that was radical. The invention of the personal computer, that was radical. And you know what I call it? I call it fear-mongering. And I call it soothsaying. And I say, beware of the soothsayers. Because you are amazing. You have come through 20 years of study. You're told that you need to be very adaptable. You need to be very networked. You need to be very present. You need to brand yourselves. I don't hear enough about integrity, and I don't hear enough about commitment, and I don't hear enough about basic stuff. You're told that you need to be more mindful. What? Sorry, that's a WTF moment. If you're not already mindful, you should be very worried. I understand, you know, that sometimes people need to be told to think, but surely we're beyond that point. Surely we don't need someone to use some Eastern concept that's 3,000 years old called yoga to teach us how to relax. Surely we don't need to be told that we need to network or project or broadcast our personal emojis or how to be more efficient with our communication. Surely we should go back to basics. I suggest that we take some solace in the fact that the world isn't changing nearly so dramatically as we're told. If it were, I mean, I remember in the 1980s, I had all these books. I was at high school through to 89, and I was kind of obsessed. I wanted to be an astronaut or an astrophysicist or something to do with astro. So I knew every person's name who had landed on the moon, like the name of the pilots, the name, the Apollo numbers, which ones had blown up, who had been killed, Gus Grissom, and all those guys. And then nothing happened, and then the space shuttle, and then the Challenger blew up in 86. And I remember kind of thinking that I was living in a time of change, but not a lot has happened except that I don't trust the news anymore. I don't believe a single word that I read in the newspaper. I don't have any faith in what people tell me as a fact. Have you noticed that your friends might say to you, did you know that 50% of this, where does that statistic come from? I would say the one big change is that we live now in a post-truth world. I'm not a political guy. I'm not a religious guy. But I would argue that the one great sadness to me is that, if anything, forget about automation, forget about job losses, we're less liberal, less open-minded than we used to be, in my opinion. If I could encourage and abuse the privilege that I have to speak to you today about the future of work, I'd call it this, is please go out there and tell the truth, commit yourself to your tasks, make peace with your decisions, breathe. Always remember to breathe. Thank you very much.